Y'all, Halloween season is here, and if you are anything like me, I bet you're making a ton of plans to get out and celebrate. But look, before you do, I need to tell you about a relatively new event up in Kentucky that is quickly becoming one of the premier celebrations of the season, one that you probably shouldn't miss. It's called the Battletown Witch Festival. That's right, on Saturday, October 26th, Meade County, Kentucky is throwing a big old family-friendly event that celebrates the dark and sordid past of the Bluegrass State's supernatural heritage. The festival will be held down at the YMCA Camp Piamingo in Otter Creek Park, and they're going to have all sorts of special attractions for spooky folks like us, from live performances and panels to storytelling sessions and paranormal investigators. There'll be bespoke vendor booths, interactive exhibits, and even costume contests, bounce houses, and face painting for the little ones. Oh, did I mention the Battletown Witch Festival is entirely free, so head over to battletownwitch.com right now for more information or connect with them on social media for updates. And y'all, make plans early to avoid missing out on what will most definitely be a spooktacular event. We've gone ahead and put links in the show notes for you. But wait, you might be wondering, why is it called the Battletown Witch Festival? That's an awful chilling name, isn't it? Well, you're in luck, because on today's episode, we're going to tell you the story of Leah Smock, the woman known as the Battletown Witch. Because here's the thing, y'all. Even though she has a scary name, it turns out that the true horror is what happened to her. Southern Gothic is a podcast that explores the history behind some of the American South's darkest days, greatest mysteries, and most chilling ghost stories. Today's episode is made possible through the support of Meade County Tourism. The small, rural community of Battletown, Kentucky, sits nestled in the rolling hills and hollers of Meade County, where the northern border of the Bluegrass State meets the gentle flow of the winding Ohio River. This historic, unincorporated community is located in the central part of the state, and while it is an hour's drive from Louisville, time spent mostly in Indiana due to the bend of the river, in actuality, Battletown is only about 35 miles from the Kentucky metropolis, at least as the crow flies. But life in Battletown couldn't be more different than that of the bustling urban environs of Derby City. The close-knit community is known for its quiet, laid-back atmosphere and picturesque landscape. Historically, Battletown has been a small agricultural hub with much of its economy tied to farming and related activities, but in the 18th century, the first pioneers were attracted to the area due to the abundance of wild game. Ultimately, though, it was the presence of limestone deposits that helped the region flourish. Over time, soil can become acidic from crop production, so farmers add agricultural lime called calcium carbonate to their plots to help neutralize it and improve the soil's quality, making their land more conducive to growing crops like tobacco, corn, and various grains. The prevalence of limestone in central Kentucky has not only been a key contributor to the state's agricultural productivity over the years, but the industry that has developed to export lime has become an integral part of the economy to this very day. As for Battletown, well, in the early days of this industry's development, the wooded hills and lush forests offered all of the resources necessary for a supporting industry to spring up. You see, all that locally produced lime was shipped in barrels down to New Orleans by riverboat, And that meant someone needed to make all those containers, so locals did just that. They were called coopers, and they were highly skilled craftsmen who made wooden barrels, casks, and other similar containers. Yet in those early days, this area wasn't called Battletown. Rather, it was a community known as Staples with a, quote, wilder and less settled part known as Lapland. In 1885, when Mac Bennett, the owner of a general store out on Wolf Creek Road, applied for a post office, he was denied the request due to the name. There's apparently another Staples in Kentucky, so he had to come up with something new. Well, as he was trying to figure that out, one day 2 men named Nathan Hubbard and Jim Bennett got into a big old fight in front of his store, and some say it was over a girl, others that it was a dispute over whiskey, but either way, the quarrel amused the general store owner, and so he decided to submit the name Battletown to the postal authorities as a result, and the name was approved. Now today, Battletown still might not be widely known, but as we've discovered in places all across the South, stories like this one have become woven into the fabric of these communities, passed down from generation to generation in the form of oral history, patiently waiting for someone to enshrine them in the written word so that they might live on for future generations to discover after the folks who were there are long gone. Of course, as y'all know, most of the time these stories are a bit ghostly or strange in theme, and such is the case here in Old Lapland, a place that, according to Annie Hamilton Eamon, the head of tourism for Meade County and chairperson for the Battletown Witch Festival, is a place filled with mystery.
There's so much stuff that is associated in Lapland that's incredible, like little people, and we have these really, really good stories of like the Cherokee Bigfoot and the Tree of Life and Seven Springs. There's so much like native historical things that are also located down in Battletown. It really is such a weird kind of Kentucky kind of place that is full of, I wouldn't call it magic, but like mysticism that you can only feel when you're in the quiet places in the woods.
And it's there, deep within those woods, that the community's most notorious piece of local lore was born. An otherwise forgotten cemetery on a restricted piece of land that is home to the final resting place of a young woman that legend claims to be the only witch burned alive in the history of the United States. For almost 2 centuries, folks in Battletown, Kentucky have claimed the spirit of Leah Smock has been haunting the hills and hollers of their beloved community. A claim that purports this young girl was a powerful practitioner of witchcraft, capable of wielding supernatural forces that frightened her neighbors so much they burned her alive. It is a legend shrouded in mystery, and one that continues to captivate everyone who hears it to this very day, leaving us all to wonder who really was Leah Smock, the woman known as the Battletown Witch. My name is Brandon Scheck-Snyder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. Legend says that the old Betsy Daly Cemetery in Battletown, Kentucky, is haunted by the spirit of Leah Smock, a young woman who was buried there back in 1840 at the age of 22 after she was burned alive for being a witch. Some who've experienced such encounters there say they've seen her apparition floating amongst the tombstones in this remote and now wildly overgrown burying ground. They claim she appears in a long white robe or dress surrounded by a purple mist or haze and looks much as she did in life, a slender-framed woman with long, raven-black hair and deep, dark eyes. Of course, the folks who dare travel out to the cemetery to pay respects to the young woman, or maybe tempt fate, do so with great intention as there's no easy way to get there. The Elizabeth Daily Cemetery, as it's officially known, is tucked away deep in a secluded, wooded area on private property, accessible only by foot. It's a mile hike from the nearest dirt road, partially through a dry creek bed. About 70 other of Meade County's earliest pioneers have been laid to rest there alongside Leah, some marked by simple field stones, but Leah was the first, and certainly most famous. Local historian Gerald Fisher writes that, quote, "The cemetery was used from 1840 to about 1920, some 80-odd years, when, for whatever reason, it was abandoned. And today, it certainly looks like it. There are gravestones covered in ivy with no discernible paths through them, and many of these markers, including Leah's, are partially hidden by an ever-growing layer of fallen leaves and pine needles." The old cemetery is now off limits to the public after issues with vandalism, but if you grew up around here, then chances are you've hiked out there to see what all the fuss is about when it comes to this notorious local legend. Kay Hamilton, a Battletown native and author of the book Burned as a Witch, The Legend of Leah Smock, told me firsthand how popular both the legend and the infamous burying ground were for them when they were growing up.
I have lived in Battletown my entire life and grew up with the stories of Leah Smock. My uncle would always take us, the kids, the cousins, and any neighbor kids over to the witch's grave every year for Halloween to give us a spooky experience, and would tell the stories along the way. And over the years, I've heard all of those stories from my uncle, my dad, and my father-in-law. My uncle was actually the historian. He was not my blood uncle, but he married my mom's sister. And my uncle's great-grandfather was just a year and 1 month older than Leah Smock. And the stories have been passed down through the generations through my uncle, his dad, and his grandfather, and his great-grandfather.
But while the legend of Leah Smock, the witch, has captured the imagination of generations of Battletown natives like Miss Hamilton, the mystery of who she truly was is as difficult to uncover as the path to that old burying ground. Was Leah Smock as evil as those who killed her claimed? Does her spirit still haunt the community of Battletown? And most curious of all, was she even a witch in the first place? Leah Smock was born in Virginia in 1818 to John Smock and Margaret Ann Scott. John was the descendant of old Dutch immigrants and was born in New Jersey in 1797. Margaret was of Scottish heritage and hailed from Pennsylvania. They were both baptized Christians, and it is said that they raised their children as such, and that Leah and her siblings always said their prayers before bed each night. But some do claim that Margaret also believed in the old ways, and maybe, just maybe, that is how Leah came to be who she was. Well, For several years, the couple moved around, and by 1830, they found their way to Kentucky and eventually Meade County, when in 1839, John bought 300 acres of farmland.
They ended up in Meade County and bought 300 acres of farmland here. The people here at the time, from what I know, the people who lived in the vicinity were farmers. They grew crops. They had cattle. They were coopers. Leah's dad was a cooper. He farmed also, but we have a lot of lime rock in the area. And they would burn the lime in lime kilns to make lime dust. And then they would ship that by barrels on flatboats down the river. A lot of the neighbors were coopers. They made the barrels to ship the lime. Leah's dad was a cooper, and her neighbors were coopers.
As for Leah, she was said to be a beautiful young woman of small stature. She had long, dark hair and fair skin and was intelligent beyond her years, capable of conversing with adults on their level at an awfully young age. In fact, she even finished school early, as she easily learned everything that a teacher could possibly educate a child on anyway. So, what did she do? Well, when she wasn't helping her father make barrels or her mother with her two younger siblings, she spent her free time out alone in the woods of old Lapland. There, she was often seen picking wild berries or gathering flowers or herbs or other possible ingredients to make what were most likely healing remedies. But some in the community who saw her behavior assumed something a little different, that she must be out there alone in the woods doing something they didn't understand, like gathering ingredients for some sort of potion or spell, right? Whether that's true or not, we'll never know, but if Leah's interests weren't peculiar enough for the folks in Staples as it was, she also seemed to have a deep kinship with animals that made some think she might have had the power to tame them.
They were like pets to her, the wild animals. They said the coyotes, the fox. She was seen many times in the woods with the animals, but the people thought it was just strange that she just stayed in the woods a lot. And of course, rumors started, and she was kind to the kids, but they were not so kind to her.
As Leah walked through the woods, she also carried a rather unique walking stick with her, one with a serpentine head. The beautiful staff had been given to her as a gift from one of her only real friends, a Native American gentleman named Jim, whom locals at the time called Indian Joe. According to Gerald Fisher, the pair had met sometime between 1834 and 1838, and he seems to have had an incredible impact on the young woman who was otherwise ostracized, and their friendship continued until Leah's untimely death.
He was likely a Huron, locally known as Wyandotte, living in Indiana opposite Lapland. He lived a long time near Battletown, Kentucky, perhaps 85 years or more. He became a friend and likely confidant of Leah. It has been speculated that he shared his knowledge of Native American lore and sorcery with Leah, a proposition believed by many.
Again, we might not ever know the true extent of Leah's powers or whether they were even supernatural at all, but legend claims that by the time she was 12, people started to take notice. It was then that Leah started to exhibit an uncanny ability to see the future and prophesize events before they happened. She predicted the weather and seasonal changes with incredible accuracy, and according to some, she could also tell if a sick person would live or die. often contradicting the doctors who treated them. So you can imagine this was quite impressive to her neighbors at first. But soon enough, these things she did started to make them fear her, and rumors began to swell that Leah Smock was a witch.
They thought she caused a baby to die. They thought she caused crops to dry up. They thought she caused horses to die. They thought she caused all of these strange things to happen, and they blamed Leah for it. Now, whether it was her fault or not, but they blamed Leah. And I think they thought she was an evil child.
Stories began circulating through the community that Leah was a witch, and so many of her neighbors began to harass and ridicule her. According to local lore, Leah did not take this well, and she started to lash out at them for their mistreatment. Legend says that she would first get a distant look in her eyes as if she were detaching from reality, and then she would tilt her head to the side as if she were contemplating her revenge. One such occasion took place when a group of local boys decided to follow her out into the woods, where they cornered her and began to taunt her. In response, Leah did just as I described. She calmly but intensely stared back at them, her head tilted to the side, as a group of wild animals started to gather around her, snarling at the bullies whose overconfidence quickly turned to fear. Frantically, the boys took off into the woods, but they never made it home. Some say that days later, the young men were discovered wandering through the dark woods, lost and completely out of their minds, while others say they died from fright. On another occasion, it's said that when one of Leah's neighbors brought home a team of horses to work his farm, she excitedly went over to ask if she could pet them. She was an animal lover after all, but the man refused and told her absolutely not. Disappointed by his response, Leah decided to do it anyway and brushed her hand down the nose of one of the steeds before the man grabbed her and dragged her away. The next morning, that horse was found dead, and a second died the following day. With tales like this circulating through the community, it's no wonder why people began to fear her, especially as over time these tales of Leah's treachery grew in size. But the most chilling story told that purports the young woman had evil in her heart claims she took the life of a newborn child.
This woman had a baby, and Leah wanted to hold the baby or touch the baby, and the mother said, "No, you don't touch my baby. Don't get near it." I think she was probably, maybe at that time, afraid of Leah, but Leah managed to get close enough and touch the baby, and the mom became very angry, told Leah to leave, and Leah said, "Your baby will be dead by morning."
Tragically, Leah was right. The next morning, the infant was dead. Now, whether or not Leah actually knew something about the health of that child that no one else did, or vengefully cursed them, is a mystery, but to both her neighbors and that grieving mother, they believed Leah Smock had caused that poor child's death. And to make matters worse, Local lore claims that when the community gathered to pay their respects and lay the poor infant to rest, Leah showed up as well and approached the coffin in an attempt to touch the child once more. But again, she was rebuked and hastily pulled away. So that night, she purportedly returned to the home of that family and something uncanny happened.
All of the cats in the area came, and the dogs, and the cats climbed on the roof and screeched all night long. And the dogs came around and they howled all night long. And they finally dragged Leah away. And when she left, the cats left and the dogs left. And they were sure she was a witch.
As horrific of an accusation as this was, this incident still wasn't the final straw for the people of Staples. They were worried, scared, and angry for sure, but they didn't take action yet. That is, until the day came when they believed Leah attacked their livelihood. As Coopers, John Smock and his neighbors made barrels, a trade that on the surface might seem like mere woodwork, but in reality is a highly skilled craft that is still celebrated today in the state. After all, Kentucky is the heart of the bourbon industry. You see, in order to make a barrel, the cooper would first have to craft wooden staves from carefully selected wood, shaping them in such a way that they would fit together tight enough to be waterproof without any glue or nails. All that kept them from falling apart was the tension of the large metal hoops fitted around them. It's said that John Smock's barrels were always strong, and he took great pride in the amount of time he spent on his craft. His neighbors also worked just as hard to produce barrels, but one day, their barrels started falling apart for seemingly no reason, while John's remained solid and strong. How could this happen? They questioned. Well, I bet you know where this is going. They believe that, without a doubt, Leah Smock had cursed them. After all, how could everyone in town have had such misfortune while John continued to prosper? The men grew angry and desperate, and eventually they decided there was only one way to deal with this problem, only one way to save their community from this evil witch living in their midst. They would burn her alive. The practice of witchcraft has been present in various forms across almost every culture and time, making its historical origins difficult to pinpoint precisely. But one of the earliest records of a witch can be found in the first book of Samuel, likely written sometime between 931 and 721 BC. Now, early witches were likely nothing more than natural healers whose spiritual beliefs and practices were misunderstood, but as we know today, most communities saw them as evil. And y'all, anytime fear and superstition collide, nothing good can happen. As a result, significant outbreaks of witch hysteria occurred during the Middle Ages, sparked by the 1487 publication of Heinrich Kramer's book Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. This book provided guidelines for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches, and it played a crucial role in spreading the fear of witchcraft across Europe, resulting in up to 80,000 executions between 1500 and 1660 in countries like Germany, France, England, and Scotland. These executions were done through all sorts of different methods, from hanging and beheading to drowning, and, of course, the most notorious of all, burning at the stake. But this wasn't done everywhere, though. Burning witches was practiced primarily in Catholic regions like modern-day Germany, Austria, France, and Spain, where they believed fire cleansed the soul, what they deemed an appropriate punishment for heresy, which to them is what witchcraft was. After all, they thought these women had made a deal with the devil. These cultural and religious differences are the reason why, when the hysteria of witchcraft spread to the American colonies, culminating in the Salem witch trials of 1692, those who were accused and found guilty were hanged rather than burned. However, unlike Leah Smock, the 19 individuals hanged in Salem at least had a trial, or at least some semblance of one, even if it was a bit of a sham. The men who decided to exact their punishment on Leah? Well, who knows how they came to their conclusion. All we do know is that it was a hot August day in 1840 when they chose to carry it out. That day, Leah's parents had decided to head into the village for supplies, leaving their daughter at home alone to do her chores and go about her life as usual. But little did they realize that as they were leaving, a group of neighbors was hiding nearby, waiting for them to be out of earshot. And as soon as they were, the men stormed the home, violently dragging Leah out and binding her hands and legs with rope before throwing her into the smokehouse and slamming the door shut behind them. They then set fire to the building. It didn't take long for everyone within earshot to know what was going on, and the plume of smoke that rose up into the sky beckoned folks to come from all over. At the sight, John and Margaret turned and rushed back home as fast as they could, but by the time they got there, it was too late.
They said they could hear her screams echoing through the hollers. And of course, a crowd gathered. And by then, there was nothing anyone could do. The smokehouse was fully engulfed in flames. And Leah's mom and dad stood there. And they said her mom just cried and cried and cried. And they just let it happen. They just let it happen.
As if witnessing this horrific act was not enough, hearing the pleading screams of their daughter begging for help, John and Margaret had to wait days for the fire to die down enough for them to be able to retrieve Leah's body. And according to lore, Margaret refused to leave the site until that happened, until her daughter could be properly laid to rest. It was then, either out of grief, fatigue, or maybe, just maybe the supernatural, she said she saw Leah's ghost, to which she asked her daughter, "Leah, why did you let this happen?" No one knows if Leah responded to her mother from the other side that day, and if she did, what it is that she said. Once the embers had cooled, Leah Smock's body was retrieved and placed in a coffin. They then loaded her onto a wagon and brought her to a spot on the family's property to bury her, a location that eventually became the Elizabeth Daly Cemetery. Some say that her parents chose not to mark the site of Leah's burial out of fear that their neighbors might do something to her body after they left, but the young man whom she'd recently begun a romantic relationship with took it upon himself to carve a marker for her out of limestone. It said simply, "Leah Smock departed this life August 21st, 1840, age 22 years, 7 months. This is the same headstone that remains today partially covered in debris from fallen leaves and pine needles. It's the same headstone that Mrs. Hamilton's Uncle Cowboy took children out to visit every Halloween. The same one where folks claim to have seen Leah's apparition. A claim that started within days of her death.
A good ghost is hard to keep down. And through the years, Leah's legend has been kept alive by hunters and other wanderers who claim to have seen her or something strange drifting among the 70 or so graves in the Little Hilltop Cemetery. The Louisville Courier-Journal, Friday, October 31st, 1975.
About a week after Leah's violent murder and subsequent burial, a couple of hunters were out in the forest near John Smock's land when they came face to face with something unusual. Legend claims that it was the apparition of Leah herself, but what they actually saw has been lost to time. Whatever it was, though, it frightened them so badly that the men decided to gather up 2 wagon loads of sandstone rocks and take them out to where the Smocks had buried their beloved daughter. They then proceeded to dig 3 feet into the earth and began pouring these pure white stones into the hole until it was not only filled, but the rocks protruded up above ground yet another 3 feet over where Leah had been buried.
And there are still rocks piled on her grave to this day.
The men thought this would protect them, that these stones would keep Leah's spirit from rising and escaping death, but their effort was futile. Whether she was a witch or not, no grave could hold the spirit of this beautiful, kind, and intelligent young woman down. And maybe that actually is her spirit, or maybe it's the stories that keep her legacy alive. You see, Kay Hamilton's Uncle Cowboy took it upon himself to be the tradition bearer for much of the oral history surrounding Leah Smock's life and legacy, and as such, he collected quite a few first-hand tales of folks encountering the spirit of Leah Smock. This interest probably started when Cowboy, who was born in 1914, was a boy, as he claimed that his father not only knew Indian Joe, but had also had an encounter with Leah's apparition sometime around the early 1920s. He described the ghost as, quote, wearing a long white robe with black ties at each wrist and a long black tie at the waist. Another oft-told encounter came in the 60s when, as Cowboy describes, a pair of loggers from Battletown were out in the woods looking for white oak trees to split into barrel staves. One of the men was apparently hard at work, cutting a tree with a chainsaw when the ghost of Leah suddenly appeared out of nowhere and began floating toward him. Well, without hesitation, he dropped that chainsaw and took off frantically into the woods. His partner, however, didn't see what had happened. All he saw was that the chainsaw was just lying there on the ground, still running, his colleague nowhere in sight. So calmly, he picked up the chainsaw, shut it off, and started to look for his missing partner, eventually opting to get in his truck to cover more ground. It was then that he saw his colleague in the distance, running through the woods in a frenzy. It took a minute, but when he finally calmed down, the logger described the apparition he had witnessed out in the woods as many do. It was a woman in a long, white dress with long dark hair floating across the ground. The man then swore he'd never go back to those woods ever again. Now, y'all, these are only a few of the many stories that have been told over the years, but it isn't just Leah's apparition that folks encounter out there in the woods near the Betsy Daly Cemetery. The purported witch makes herself known in many other ways. Local historian Gerald Fisher wrote about his own experience attempting to visit the cemetery.
I was once told by a man who knew the area well that he would guide me to the site of Leah's grave, but only after the first killing frost had driven the rattlesnakes and copperheads deep underground. Even then, he suggested we carry sidearms just in case.
You see, it seems that apparently, even in death, Leah's kinship with animals is as powerful as ever, as it seems that snakes are drawn to her grave in an effort to protect her, and men who attempt to hunt there always seem to leave empty-handed.
They say that the hunters, no one has been able to kill any game over in that area, that she protects all the wildlife. And I've had people tell me that they've been hunting over there and, were an excellent marksman, deer hunting, and could not kill a deer, would shoot it and would miss it. It's just, she will not allow animals to be killed.
Almost 200 years have passed since Leah Smock was violently burned to death in that smokehouse. And while it's awful difficult to tell where the legend ends and the truth begins, her memory has most certainly been kept alive by those stories. But was Leah Smock actually a witch? Did she really do some of the evil things that local lore claims she did? Or is it all just a legend?
I personally wouldn't want to call her a witch, not an evil witch, despite the stories of the accusations of being a witch. They were all accusations. I personally believe that she was just a beautiful, very intelligent young lady who was misunderstood. That's what I think.
This seems to be the prevailing sentiment when it comes to the legacy of the Battletown Witch. That Leah Smock was nothing more than an intelligent young woman who, for whatever reason, was targeted by a community for being different. It's a tale that we've seen play out far too often in history, from the women of Salem to Grace Sherwood, the Witch of Pungo. And y'all, you might be surprised to hear that even Cowboy Bennett, the man who collected all those stories and helped piece together the local history, believed this as well. He told the Louisville Courier-Journal back in 1975 that, quote, "The people they thought was witches back then was just regular folks who had a little bit too much IQ. She could look at somebody who was sick and tell they were ready to die." But y'all, according to Annie Hamilton Eman, the head of tourism for Meade County and chairperson and co-founder of the Battletown Witch Festival, there may have been one other reason as to why Leah was killed. Her father was in the middle of a dispute over land.
Back whenever people first started buying plots of land in Kentucky from the Virginia Company, there was single people would own entire counties, and they would hire people to come out and sell the pieces for them. Sometimes those peoples weren't the most reputable, and sometimes certain plots of land would be sold twice, and that happened to Leah's father, John. So around 1840, somewhere around there, he was in a legal dispute with another person, saying that they both owned title to the land that John's farm was on. That was something that was contentious that was going on around the time of Leah's death, that he was in a legal fight with another person in the community over that piece of land. Now, when you talk about the other whispers that John's farm did better than everybody else's. John's barrels were better than everybody else's. He was getting a little bit ahead of everybody else in a community that in pioneer times saw good times and bad. And with his daughter being kind of peculiar, and it might have been a convenient way to get them to be not liked in the community by her being a witch. So that could have been how that rumor actually started.
Could this ultimately be why stories of Leah Smock's wickedness have been quietly passed down through generations of Battletown residents? Could Leah have actually been the victim of this heinous act not because they really thought she was a witch? Or maybe it was an accident and they needed to justify themselves. Well, maybe. And it is for that reason that the folks in Meade County have decided to change the discussion and celebrate Leah for who she was, rather than the legacy that was forced upon her.
We decided to look more into her, and we noticed that people had been giving her such a disservice, calling her the witch. And so we wanted to put something together that hit all those wonderful things about being a Kentuckian, about mountain magic and spiritualism and herbalism, and those like female traditions that have been passed generation to generation in Kentucky from the pioneer days, and how that can kind of be misconstrued into something else.
And so the Battletown Witch Festival was born, an annual event that celebrates the life of Leah Smock herself as a person, an individual who loved and was loved, rather than a heinous witch who vengefully cursed this community. As such, Battletown Witch Festival attendees are treated to insightful discussions on the topic, led by historians, paranormal investigators, and local experts, all in the hopes of not only shedding light on Leah, but also the history of folklore, herbalism, and spiritualism in this historic part of Kentucky. Of course, the celebration is also family-friendly and features a range of activities that embrace the spirit of the spooky season, from themed vendors to interactive experiences and Halloween-focused activities for the little ones. A great way to remember Leah's kindness. The festival first took place in 2022, but it's grown rapidly in popularity, drawing visitors from all across the country, with a crowd of 10,000 folks expected to head down to Meade County in 2024, a fact that Annie Hamilton Eamon attributes to the individual at the heart of the celebration, Leah Smock.
We have people come from all over the place. We have vendors coming from Ohio and Tennessee and Eastern Kentucky. And so I think people somehow read the story and really connect with it. And that's what makes us excited. And that's what makes us feel like we're doing a service to Leah in this life, where she didn't get that in the last one.
As for the purported sightings of Leah's spirit, well, even if she wasn't a witch, that certainly doesn't negate the dozens, if not hundreds of encounters that have been reported over the years. After all, if you were considered the only witch to be burned in American history, would your spirit be able to rest? And for that, Leah Smock deserves to be remembered. My name is Brandon Scheck-Snyder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. Southern Gothic is an independent podcast produced by Southern Gothic Media. Today's episode was researched by Loretta Allen edited by Rachel Boyd and made possible through the support of Meade County Tourism. For more information about the life of Leah Smock and the Battletown Witch Festival, visit their website at battletownwitch.com or connect with them on social media for annual updates on the festival's date and location. The links are in the show notes. And y'all, as always, thanks for listening.
Lucky Little Shacks.